I'm Polly, and this is the tale of how my life was completely appended twice. I suppose I ought to begin at the beginning. I was born in a tiny suburban town to devoted parents, Mark and Lisa Smith. Mom was a nurse, while Dad was a writer. Despite our lack of wealth, we were content. Up until I was 12, my life was rather typical. Everything changed at that point. My folks were traveling home after a dinner party on a soggy Tuesday night. The phone rang as my grandmother and I were watching a dumb cartoon at home. When I heard my grandmother's muted sobbing coming from the kitchen, I will always remember the shiver that went down my spine. The days that followed were a haze. They told us that Mom died on impact. Dad almost made it. He was a shadow of the person I knew when I eventually saw him in the hospital. The doctor claimed he would never be able to walk again since his legs were crushed. He croaked, "Polly," and reached for my hand. "I'm so sorry, my love. I'm so sorry." Why he was apologizing was beyond me. He wasn't to blame. Their automobile was struck by an intoxicated motorist. But when I became older, I understood that Dad felt bad about the state of our life, for the difficulties we would encounter, for the mother I had lost, and for the father he believed he was no longer capable of being. However, my father, Mark Smith, was more resilient than he realized. He jumped right into his job after leaving the hospital and getting comfortable in his wheelchair. Having always been a gifted writer, he now focused all of his concentration on his work as an editor at the main newspaper in the city. Dad made sure I had all I needed when I started to enter my teens. He urged me to lead as normal a life as possible, to join clubs, and to make friends. In actuality, though, I liked hanging around with him. He would assist me with my homework, we would debate literature, and we would watch old films together. Dad urged that I attend a distant institution when it came time for college. "You need to spread your wings, kiddo," he stated. "Don't stress over me. I'll be all right." Despite my hesitation, I knew he was correct. I decided to major in accounting at State University. I met Jessica, who would wind up becoming my best friend there. I got to know Michael, her second cousin, through Jessica. When I informed Michael about my dad, he was hilarious, compassionate, and unfazed. In fact, he and Dad clicked right away when he first met him, connecting over their mutual appreciation of vintage music. "Your old man's cool," Michael subsequently informed me. "And you're pretty amazing for taking care of him all these years." I dismissed it, yet I felt radiant on the inside. I felt for the first time since the accident that perhaps, just possibly, I could have a regular life someday. One filled with laughter, love, and yes, even a family of my own. Life appeared to fit together like jigsaw pieces after graduation. Michael began working as a long-haul truck driver, and I got a position at the local tax agency. Before he proposed on a cool autumn evening in the park where we had our first date, we dated for 2 years. Even though I was ecstatic, I had to clarify one thing. "Yes, Michael, but I'm unable to abandon my father. I'm needed by him." A broad smile spread across Michael's face. "There is no other way that I would have it. We'll all share a home. The three of us can fit in your dad's flat, right?" The wedding was modest yet exquisite. To give me away, Dad insisted on wheeling himself down the aisle. As Michael and I stood hand in hand, not a single person in the house was dry-eyed. I had the impression that I was living out a fantasy. However, every fairy tale has its antagonists, and mine were my sister-in-law Emily and mother-in-law Karen. I could tell they disapproved of me as soon as I met them. "So your father is handicapped?" Karen had inquired at our initial encounter. Her nose wrinkled as though she had detected an awful odor. I corrected him, attempting to seem objective. "But he works as an editor." "He's disabled," I said. "Aunt, how nice," she cut in, obviously not interested. "Darling Michael, are you certain about this? There are a lot of lovely females from decent homes." My cheeks burned with humiliation and rage. Bless him, Michael sprang to my defense right away. "Polly comes from a good family, Mom. That remains the same despite her dad's handicap. All that counts is that I adore her." Karen stopped talking after that, but I could still sense the displeasure in her eyes. Emily was just as aloof towards me, following in her mother's footsteps. As promised, Michael moved in with Dad and me after the wedding. Our lives settled into a cozy pattern. Michael would be traveling for days at a time while I worked at the tax office, and we would all gather together for supper when he got home. However, the mood in our house altered whenever Karen and Emily came to visit. They would hardly acknowledge Dad's presence as they strutted around as if they owned the room. I once heard Karen murmuring to Emily, "It's unfortunate. Michael has a lot of room for improvement. He is now forced to live with this daughter and her father, who is disabled. What if they become parents? Can you picture the genes?" Despite my anger, I held my tongue for Michael's benefit. It was becoming more and more difficult for me to maintain the calm. I sobbed one evening following a particularly stressful visit from Karen and Emily. I was crying when Michael discovered me in our bedroom. He murmured, "Hey, hey," and drew me into his embrace. "What's wrong?" I paused. "Your mom and sister. They despise me. They believe that because of Dad, I am unworthy of you." Michael's expression grew stern. "That is absurd. I now consider you and your father to be family. It is their issue, not ours, if they are unable to accept that." Although I was reassured by his remarks, I couldn't get rid of the thought that our problems with Karen and Emily were only getting started. As the months passed, Michael's trucking business began to flourish. He was always on the road, crisscrossing the country in his big rig. I missed him terribly when he was gone, but I threw myself into my work at the tax office and spent my evenings keeping Dad company. One crisp autumn evening, as I was helping Dad into bed, Michael called. His voice crackled with excitement over the phone. "Polly, I've been thinking," he said. "How would you feel about buying a townhouse? It would be easier for your dad to move around in a wheelchair. He could spend more time outside. Plus, you could have a garden, something to keep you busy when I'm on the road." The more he talked, the more I warmed to the idea. I glanced at Dad, who was pretending not to eavesdrop. "What do you think, Dad?" I asked, putting the phone on speaker. Dad's eyes lit up. "A garden would be nice," he admitted. "And it would be easier to get outside." That settled it. Over the next few weeks, we threw ourselves into house hunting. We finally found the perfect place. A spacious townhouse with wide doorways, a roll-in shower for Dad, and a beautiful backyard. Taking out a mortgage was scary, but with Michael's income and mine, plus the rent from Dad's old apartment, we managed to make it work. We moved in on a sunny Saturday in spring, and I'll never forget the look on Dad's face as he wheeled himself out onto our new patio. "This is perfect, sweetie," he said, his eyes misty. "Thank you." We spent the next few months settling in, making the place our own. I planted a small vegetable garden, and Dad would sit outside for hours, soaking up the sun and fresh air. It was idyllic. Then came the housewarming party. We invited friends, colleagues, and yes, Karen and Emily. The party was in full swing when they arrived, fashionably late as usual. They sauntered in, eyeing everything with barely concealed envy. As we moved through the house, I could see the wheels turning in Karen's head. When we reached the master bedroom, she turned to me with a sly smile. "You know, Polly," she said, her voice low, "this would be perfect for Michael and me. Why don't you send your father to a nursing home? Then I could move in here." I felt like I'd been slapped. Excuse me. Oh, don't look so shocked, Karen continued. Your father isn't well. He's not a whole person anymore, is he? He doesn't need all this luxury. A nursing home would be more than enough for someone in his condition. Before I could respond, Karen marched out to the patio where Dad was chatting with some guests. To my horror, she grabbed the handles of his wheelchair and started pushing him towards the driveway. Karen, I shouted, running after her. What are you doing? If he won't go to a nursing home, he can stay outside, she sneered. That's what you wanted, isn't it? For him to be outdoors. I was shaking with rage and disbelief. Thankfully, Michael had heard the commotion and came running. His face turned red with anger when he saw what his mother was doing. Mom, he bellowed. What the hell are you doing? Let go of Mark's chair right now. Karen looked shocked at Michael's tone. But, honey, I don't want to hear it. Michael cut her off. You and Emily need to leave now. After they left, Michael apologized profusely to Dad and me. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I had no idea she would. I'm just so sorry. Dad reached out and patted Michael's hand. It's not your fault, son. Some people, they just can't understand. Life settled into a new rhythm after the housewarming incident. Karen and Emily kept their distance, which suited me just fine. Michael threw himself into his work, taking on more long-haul routes to help cover our new mortgage. I split my time between my job at the tax office and tending to our home and Dad. 2 years passed in the blink of an eye. Our life fell into a comfortable routine. Michael was on the road more often than not, but when he was home, our little family was happy. Dad's health was stable, and he seemed content, spending his days in the garden or working on his editing from home. Then came the call that shattered my world. I was at work when my phone rang. An unfamiliar male voice greeted me. Mrs. Thompson, this is Officer Rodriguez from the Highway Patrol. My heart dropped into my stomach. Yes, I managed to squeak out. I'm sorry to inform you that your husband, Michael Thompson, has been in a serious accident. The rest of the conversation was a blur. Words like head-on collision and didn't make it floated around me, but I couldn't process them. It wasn't until I heard myself thanking the officer and hanging up that reality began to sink in. Michael was gone. The next week was a haze of grief and disbelief. I moved through the motions of planning the funeral like a robot, barely able to comprehend what was happening. The day before the funeral, I steeled myself and called Karen. I thought she deserved to hear about her son's death from me, not from some impersonal newspaper obituary. Hello, Karen's sharp voice answered. Karen, it's Polly, I said, my voice trembling. It's about Michael. He's gone. There was an accident. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, to my shock, Karen's voice came back, dripping with venom. This is your fault, she hissed. You forced him to work so hard, driving that truck to pay for your fancy house. You killed my son. I was stunned. Karen, that's not. Save it, she snapped. I expect you to give him the best funeral money can buy, but don't expect a penny from us. You made your bed, now lie in it. The line went dead. I stood there, phone in hand, tears streaming down my face. How could she be so cruel? How could she blame me for this? The day of Michael's funeral dawned gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. The church was packed. Michael had been well-liked in the community, and it seemed like half the town had turned out to pay their respects. After the service, as people filed past to offer their condolences, I was struck by the absence of Michael's mother and sister. They hadn't even bothered to show up to their own son and brother's funeral. Dad reached out and squeezed my hand. "Their loss, sweetie," he said. "We're family, and we'll get through this together." As we pulled into our driveway, something seemed off. The lights were on in the house, which was strange because I was sure I turned everything off before we left. "Did you leave any lights on, Dad?" I asked, frowning. He shook his head. "No, I don't think so." As we got closer, I could see movement inside the house. My heart started racing. Were we being robbed on the day of Michael's funeral? No less. I helped Dad out of the car and into his wheelchair, my mind racing. Should I call the police? But as we approached the front door, I heard familiar voices inside. My blood ran cold as I recognized them. I pushed open the door to find Karen and Emily in our living room, surrounded by boxes and pieces of furniture. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, my grief momentarily forgotten in the face of this outrageous intrusion. Karen turned to me, her face a mask of false sympathy. "Oh, Polly, dear, we're just helping you pack up. After all, you can't possibly afford to keep this place now that Michael's gone." I was speechless. Emily chimed in, her voice sickeningly sweet. "Don't worry, you can go back to your father's apartment. It's cozy." I could feel the rage building inside me. "Get out," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Get out of my house right now." Karen had the audacity to look offended. "This house belongs to us now. All of Michael's property does. We're his family after all." "Like hell you are." I exploded. "Where were you today, at his funeral?" "Oh, that's right, you couldn't be bothered to show up." Karen waved her hand dismissively. "We were busy making arrangements. Now be a good girl and start packing. We'll meet you out by tomorrow." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These women hadn't shed a tear for Michael, hadn't even attended his funeral, and now they were trying to kick us out of our home. "I'm calling the police," I said, pulling out my phone. Karen and Emily exchanged worried glances. They clearly hadn't expected me to fight back. "Now, Polly," Karen began, but I cut her off. "No, you have exactly 5 minutes to get out of my house before I call the cops. This is my home. Michael and I bought it together. You have no right to be here." Maybe it was the steel in my voice or the fire in my eyes, but Karen and Emily finally seemed to realize they'd gone too far. They gathered their things and left, but not before Karen turned to me with a sneer. "This isn't over, Polly. You'll be hearing from our lawyers." The days following Michael's funeral were a blur of grief, anxiety, and paperwork. I threw myself into sorting out Michael's affairs, partly to keep busy and partly out of fear that Karen and Emily would try to swoop in and take what wasn't theirs. A week after the funeral, I received a call from a local law firm. My heart raced as I answered, fearing it was Karen making good on her threat of legal action. "Mrs. Thompson," a crisp professional voice asked. "This is James Anderson from Anderson and Partners. I'm calling regarding your late husband's will." I felt a glimmer of hope. "His will? I didn't know he had one." "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Thompson came to see us about 6 months ago. He asked that we contact you in the event of his passing." I scheduled an appointment for the next day, my mind reeling. Why hadn't Michael told me about this? What did it mean? The next morning, I wheeled Dad into Mr. Anderson's office. The lawyer greeted us warmly, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Smith, thank you for coming in," he said, gesturing for us to settle near his desk. "I'm sorry for your loss." Mr. Anderson opened a file on his desk. "Now, as I mentioned on the phone, your husband came to see us to draft his will. He was very clear about his wishes." I held my breath as Mr. Anderson began to read. "I, Michael Thompson, being of sound mind, do hereby bequeath all my worldly possessions to my beloved wife, Polly Thompson. I gasped. Dad's grip on my hand tightened. Mr. Anderson continued, "This includes our home, my truck, and all our savings. It is my wish that Polly use these resources to care for herself and her father, Mark Smith, whom I have come to love as my own." Tears were streaming down my face now. Even from beyond the grave, Michael was taking care of us. "There's more," Mr. Anderson said gently. "Mr. Thompson left a letter for you." He handed me an envelope. With shaking hands, I opened it and began to read. "My dearest Polly, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I'm so sorry for leaving you and Mark. Please know that you two were the best thing that ever happened to me. I made this will because I know how my mother and sister can be. I didn't want to worry you, but I needed to make sure you and Mark were protected if anything happened to me. You're my real family, Polly. You and Mark, not them. Take care of each other, live your lives to the fullest, and know that I'll always be watching over you. All my love, Michael." I clutched the letter to my chest, sobbing. Dad was crying too, his weathered hand patting my arm. Mr. Anderson gave us a moment before speaking again. "Mrs. Thompson, there's one more thing. Your husband's truck was insured. Given the circumstances of the accident, the insurance company will be paying out the full value of the policy." I looked up, sniffling. "What does that mean?" "It means," Mr. Anderson said with a small smile, "that you'll be receiving a substantial sum. Enough to pay off your mortgage, and then some." As we left the lawyer's office, I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. We were going to be okay. Michael had made sure of it. As we pulled into our driveway, I noticed a familiar car parked on the street. My heart sank as I recognized Karen's sleek sedan. "Oh no," I muttered. "What now?" Sure enough, Karen and Emily were waiting on our front porch. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I had Michael's letter in my pocket and the strength of his love in my heart. "Polly," Karen began as we approached. Her voice was sickly sweet. "We need to talk about Michael's estate." I stood tall, looking her straight in the eye. "No, Karen, we don't. Michael left everything to me. It's all legal and official. And do you want to know why? Because we were his real family, not you. Now please leave. You're trespassing on my property." For once, Karen was speechless. Emily tugged at her arm, whispering urgently. With one last venomous glare, they got in their car and drove away. The weeks following our meeting with the lawyer were a whirlwind of activity. I threw myself into settling Michael's affairs, grateful for the distraction from my grief. The insurance payout came through, and true to Mr. Anderson's word, it was enough to pay off our mortgage with plenty left over. One afternoon, as I was going through Michael's desk, I came across a small notebook. I opened it and found pages filled with his messy scrawl. It was a journal of sorts, filled with his thoughts and plans for our future. Thinking about starting a college fund for our future kids, one entry read, "Want to make sure they have the best start in life." My heart clenched. We had talked about having children someday, but had decided to wait until we were more financially stable. Now, reading Michael's private hopes and dreams, I felt a fresh wave of grief wash over me. "Oh, Michael," I whispered, clutching the notebook to my chest. We had so many plans. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. My mind kept drifting to the journal, to the future we'd never have. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of Michael. He was smiling, holding out his hand to me. "It's okay, Polly," he said in my dream. "Everything's going to be all right." I woke up the next morning feeling different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something had changed. As I got ready for work, a wave of nausea hit me. I barely made it to the bathroom in time, But as the days went by, the morning sickness persisted. At first, I chalked it up to stress and grief, but a small voice in the back of my mind whispered another possibility. Finally, after a week of this, I found myself standing in the pharmacy aisle, staring at pregnancy tests with trembling hands. I bought one and hurried home. The 3 minutes I waited for the result were the longest of my life. When I finally looked at the test, I saw 2 clear blue lines. I sank to the bathroom floor, a mix of emotions overwhelming me: joy, fear, grief, hope. They all swirled together in a dizzying cocktail. "Polly." Dad's voice came through the door. "Everything okay in there?" I opened the door, tears streaming down my face. Dad's expression immediately changed from concern to alarm. "What's wrong, sweetie?" he asked. I held up the test, my hand shaking. "I'm pregnant, Dad." I fell into his arms, sobbing. He held me, stroking my hair like he used to when I was a little girl. "It's okay," he murmured. "It's going to be okay. You're not alone, Polly. And this baby is a gift, a piece of Michael that will live on." His words struck a chord in me. This baby was a part of Michael, a continuation of our love. Suddenly, the fear began to recede, replaced by a fierce determination. "You're right," I said, wiping my eyes. "This baby is a gift, and we're going to be okay." Dad smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's my girl. Now let's get you something to eat. You're eating for 2 now." After all, as we made our way to the kitchen, I felt a sense of hope blooming in my chest. Yes, the road ahead would be challenging, but with my father by my side and Michael's child growing inside me, I knew we could face anything. I discovered a power I was unaware I possessed as my tummy expanded with our kid. Dad was my pillar of support, constantly lending a helpful hand or a kind word. With only the 2 of us, we established a new routine and looked forward to welcoming the newest member of our small family. I heard a vehicle come up one lovely day as I was taking care of the garden that Dad and I had planted together. When I saw Karen's car, my heart fell. Now what could they possibly desire? Naturally, I carried my big tummy in one hand as I walked to the front of the home. Standing on our doorstep, appearing at ease and a little desperate, were Karen and Emily. "Polly," Karen said, her voice not as keen as usual. We need to talk to you." I waited for her to continue, raising an eyebrow but remaining silent. Emily added, her eyes flitting anxiously. "We've had some hardship. Until we get back on our feet, we wanted to know whether we might remain at your father's former flat." What I was hearing was unbelievable. They had the gall to demand more after what they had done to us. "I'm sorry," I stated in a calm but forceful voice. "That isn't feasible. I no longer wish to connect with you." When Karen saw my growing tummy, her eyes furrowed. A mixture of disdain and dismay twisted her expression. She spat, "You're pregnant. Already? You are a small-time sex worker. It's unbelievable that you've already found another man. Even the earth doesn't seem chilly around Michael's body." Anger shot through me, but I suppressed it. I didn't offer an explanation or claim that it was Michael's kid. I didn't want my child to grow up with such an aunt and grandma. Rather, I grinned, a little evasive grin that made Karen feel even more uneasy. Calmly I responded, "My personal life is none of your concern. Now, I think it's time for you to leave." Karen seemed to want to say more, but she must have been put off by my reaction. She grabbed Emily's arm and pivoted on her heel. I had a wave of calm as I watched them drive away. I had kept my dignity, defended my family, and stood my stand. Michael would have been pleased.